6,409. That is not a population figure. It is not the number of damaged houses, and it is not the number of people sleeping under canvas tonight, though both of those numbers belong in this story, and both of them are worse than you think. 6,409 is how many separate earthquakes Indonesia's meteorological agency has logged on, and around one island since a single Saturday morning 10 days ago. Not tremors somebody thought they felt. Recorded events, each one with a timestamp, a magnitude, and a set of coordinates on a network that never blinks. Run the arithmetic and it gets stranger. 10 days is 14,400 minutes. 6,409 earthquakes inside that window comes out to roughly 1 every 2¼ minutes. Through every night, through every meal, through every attempt anyone on that island has made to sleep since the 15th of August, and the rest of the world stopped covering it around day 3. I want to walk you through what actually happened on Flores, minute by minute, from the moment the fault let go to the shock that hit the Banda Sea yesterday afternoon. Because buried in the middle of this sequence is a number that broke the pattern seismologists expected, and once you see where it happened, the whole map of this disaster changes shape. If you want the disaster desk that keeps watching after the cameras leave, subscribe now, because this island is not finished, and neither is this story. Start with the clock. 5:58 in the morning, local time, Saturday the 15th of August. Central Indonesian time. Most of Flores was still dark. The island runs long and thin east to west. About 2 million people spread across small villages, volcanic ridges, and a handful of towns you may have heard of without knowing where they are. Labuan Bajo at the western tip, the gateway harbor for Komodo National Park. Endi on the south coast, under the colored crater lakes of Kelimutu. Malmir further east, a port town. Ruteng up in the western highlands, cool and rainy and built on slopes. Flores is not a place most people outside Asia could find on a map, and that has a lot to do with why this story vanished so quickly. It is long and narrow and mountainous, a spine of volcanoes running east to west with villages tucked into the folds between them. Very little of the population is concentrated in cities. Most of it is distributed across hundreds of small settlements built from whatever the land provides, often on slopes, often reached by a single road. That distribution is beautiful, and it is also the reason a shallow earthquake here is so difficult to respond to. There is no single point of failure and no single point of rescue. There are 2 million people spread thin along a mountain chain, and when the roads go, they go everywhere at once. Offshore, about 70 kilometers north-northwest of Ende, roughly 42 miles out under the Flores Sea, a fault surface began to move. It did not move all at once. The United States Geological Survey later reconstructed the rupture from seismic recordings around the planet, and the model they published shows something that lasted about 51 seconds. 51 seconds is longer than it sounds. It is longer than most people can hold their breath in a panic. It is roughly the time it takes an elevator to climb 20 floors. For 51 seconds, a sheet of rock kept tearing. The torn area came out at about 150 kilometers long and 40 kilometers wide, which is a slab of Earth's crust, roughly the length of the island of Jamaica and about half as wide. The fault plane was oriented east-northeast and tilted southward at about 32 degrees, sloping down underneath Flores itself. In the zone of strongest movement, up and to the northwest of the starting point, the two sides of the fault slid past each other by nearly 13 feet, almost 4 meters. One story of a building in horizontal displacement along a surface the size of a small country, and the rupture reached the seafloor. That detail matters more than almost anything else in the sequence, and I will come back to it. The magnitude came in at 7.7 from the Americans. The German center put it slightly lower at 7.6 with a deeper starting point. The global moment tensor catalog put it slightly higher at 7.8. Those disagreements are normal in the first days after a big rupture, and they narrow over time, but they are worth noticing because they show up again later in this story in a way that has confused a lot of people online. Depth was the problem, 10 kilometers, according to the American estimate. Indonesia's own model placed the starting point a little deeper at around 18 kilometers. Either way, shallow. A commercial airliner cruises higher above your head than that fault was below the seafloor. Shallow earthquakes waste nothing. There is barely any rock between the rupture and the surface to soak up the energy, so what leaves the fault arrives at the villages almost intact. Across 6 districts of Flores, the shaking reached intensity 7 to 8 on the modified Mercalli scale. Level 8 is where ordinary masonry buildings suffer serious damage and poorly built ones partially collapse. It is not a measurement of the earthquake. It is a measurement of what the earthquake did to the places where people were standing. 56,000 people experienced that severe level of shaking. Another 420,000 felt shaking described as very strong. More than 1 million felt it strongly. Over 11 million people across a swath of eastern Indonesia felt it at all. Then came the water warning. Indonesia's agency issued a tsunami alert within minutes and placed 22 separate coastal areas under warning status, stretching well beyond Flores into West Nusa Tenggara, South Sulawesi, and Southeast Sulawesi. Modeled arrival times ran from about 4 minutes to just under an hour and 45 minutes after the rupture. On an island where a fault has just torn open the seafloor a few dozen miles offshore, 4 minutes is the entire evacuation window. There is no time to organize anything. There is only time to run uphill. Thousands did. The waves came, and this is where the story turns in a direction almost nobody expected. Sea level gauges along 10 stretches of coast picked up the tsunami. The highest reading in the initial agency bulletins was 94 centimeters at Morol in the Ende district, a little over 3 feet. Later analysis put the maximum recorded wave at 1.61 meters, chest high on most adults. Others were much smaller, 54 centimeters at Bulukumba, 38 at Kiwapante in Sika, 36 at Labuan Bajo. The warning was terminated a little over 2.5 hours after the rupture, once the network stopped registering dangerous sea level rises. Chest-high water is not nothing. It kills people. But hold that number, because there is a reason it is the most important number in this entire video, and it has to do with what happened on this same fault system in 1992. By 10 in the morning that Saturday, the geophysical station at Kupang had counted 111 aftershocks. By 2 in the afternoon, the national count was 235. If you saw a headline about this earthquake at all, there is a strong chance that 235 is the number you saw, because that is roughly when international coverage peaked and then began to fade. By the end of that first 24 hours, the true figure was 704. Here is what those first days look like on the ground, and I would ask you to hold this next part in mind, because it explains why the human cost of this disaster kept climbing long after the shaking supposedly stopped. Landslides came down across the mountain roads almost immediately, cutting the highway that runs the length of Flores and severing the districts nearest the epicenter from the rest of the island. Rescue teams could not reach Nagakeo, the area closest to the rupture, for a full day. Communications went down with the roads. 5 of the 15 airports in the province took damage, mostly in the terminal buildings rather than the runways. 2 port facilities were badly hit, including the terminal at Maumere, where sections of the structure came down onto areas where passengers wait. In Labuan Bajo, a hotel collapsed. On Palu, a small volcanic island of about 11,000 people sitting 20 to 30 kilometers from the epicenter, hundreds of houses were wrecked at once. The death toll climbed in stages that tell their own story. 20 by the first evening, 47 by Saturday night, 51 on Sunday, when 4 more bodies were recovered, 53, then 68, then 70, then 72, and as of the most recent official update from Indonesia's National Disaster Agency, at least 83 people are dead, with more than 230 seriously injured and over 300 with lighter injuries. Read those later increases carefully. The agency stated plainly that 8 of the additional deaths were attributed to indirect impacts of the earthquake. At least 3 people died of severe shock. One of them was a resident of Manggarai who was brought to a medical post after a morning aftershock and died a few hours later. Another died after falling during a panic. These are not people crushed by falling concrete. These are people whose bodies gave out under 10 days of never knowing whether the next one was the big one. That is the part of an earthquake sequence that almost never makes the news, and it is the reason I keep coming back to that counter. Because on day 6, the counter did something it was not supposed to do. Aftershock sequences have a shape. It is one of the most reliable patterns in all of seismology. The rate of aftershocks decays roughly in proportion to the inverse of the time since the main shock, which in plain terms means the second day should be quieter than the first, the third quieter than the second, and so on down a long tapering curve that can run for months but always trends downward. Flores did not do that. 704 events in the first 24 hours, then 746 in the second. The count then settled into what looked like the beginning of a normal decline, 668 on the third day, 649 on the fourth, 627 on the fifth. A slow taper, textbook. Then on day 6, the 20th of August, the number jumped back up to 802. That is one earthquake every 108 seconds for a full day and night. It is the highest single-day count of the entire sequence, and it arrived 5 days after the main shock when the ground was supposed to be settling down. The director of earthquake and tsunami monitoring for Indonesia's agency, Wijayanto, put it about as directly as an official can, saying that activity in the first days had not yet shown a significant decay pattern and that the temporal behavior of the sequence remained complex and had not simplified. That day was also the day the sequence stopped being an offshore statistic and became a second disaster. The night before, at 17 minutes past 11, a magnitude 5.6 shook the region hard enough to be recorded at intensity levels between 4 and 6 on the Mercalli scale, meaning strong, frightening, plaster, cracking, shaking. On the 20th, a magnitude 6.0 struck near Manggarai, and one resident died in the panic that followed. On the 21st, at 45 minutes past 6 in the morning, another magnitude 5.6 hit with its epicenter on land, 37 kilometers northeast of Ruteng, 10 kilometers deep. A man was brought to the regional hospital in Ruteng in severe shock. He died at 15 minutes past 10 that morning, on land, northeast of Ruteng. That phrase is the key to this entire sequence, and here is why. Ruteng is in the western highlands of Flores, more than 100 kilometers from where the main shock started. The original rupture was offshore to the northeast. So what was a damaging earthquake doing under the mountains in the west 6 days later? Before I answer that, tell me something in the comments, because I am curious how many of you have lived through this particular kind of fear. Not the earthquake itself. The week after. The aftershocks that keep you sitting up in the dark at 3 in the morning waiting to see if the shaking builds or fades. If you have been through an aftershock sequence anywhere in the world, tell me where, and tell me how long it took before you could sleep in your own house again. Those comments matter more than you think, because they are the part of this that no seismograph records. Now, the fault? Most people, when they hear that Indonesia had a big earthquake, picture the Sunda megathrust, the great subduction boundary that runs down the southern side of the islands where the Australian plate dives beneath Asia. That is the fault that produced the catastrophe of 2004 off Sumatra. It sits to the south of Flores. This earthquake happened on the other side of the island. North of Flores runs a structure called the Flores Back-Arc Thrust. Back-arc is the term for the region behind a volcanic chain on the opposite side from the trench. The plates in this part of Indonesia are jammed so tightly that the compression does not stay politely on the subduction side. It leaks over the top. The islands themselves get squeezed, and on the northern flank of the arc, the seafloor is being shoved southward and upward, riding over itself along a shallow angled thrust surface that dips down beneath Flores. Picture tearing a sheet of thick paper. You start a rip at one edge and pull. The tear runs, and then you stop halfway across. The paper is not relaxed now. Every fiber sitting right at the tip of that tear is suddenly carrying strain that used to be shared across the whole sheet. Stop pulling, set the paper down, and you can still watch the tear creep forward on its own, a millimeter at a time, because the stress has been concentrated into a single point. A fault rupture ends the same way. The tear stopped after 51 seconds and 150 kilometers, and the rock at the ends of that tear inherited the load. That is what an aftershock is. It is the crust rearranging itself around the edges of a hole that was ripped in it. Indonesia's agency mapped where all those thousands of events were happening and found something specific. The activity is not one blob around the epicenter. It sorts into 4 distinct clusters. The first sits off the north coast of Nagakeo, right where the main shock was, and its movement style matches the main shock, thrust faulting on an east to west trending plane. That is the Back-Arc Thrust doing what it does. The other 3 sit west and north of Manggarai. West, in the direction of Ruteng. The sequence has been migrating along and beyond the western end of the rupture, loading up the crust in a region that was not the epicenter and had no reason to expect the worst of it. That is why the deadly aftershocks of the past week have been landing under the highlands instead of out at sea. And one cluster is stranger still. The second cluster sits further offshore, north of where the Back-Arc Thrust reaches the seafloor, which means it is not on the same fault at all. One of its larger events, a magnitude 5.6, was not a thrust. It was normal faulting, extension, on a plane trending northwest to southeast. The crust in that patch is not being squeezed. It is being pulled apart. That is a fingerprint of stress transfer. The main shock did not just break its own fault. It changed the loading on neighboring structures, and some of those structures are now failing in the opposite sense. This is one of the more interesting things about the Flores sequence, and one of the least reported. There is a second reason this fault punches above its weight, and it is worth understanding if you follow earthquakes anywhere in the world. A great subduction megathrust rupture usually begins tens of kilometers down and far offshore, so its energy has to travel a long way through rock before it reaches anybody. A back-arc thrust does not. It sits close to shore, and it breaks shallow, sometimes right at the seabed, which means the towns are effectively sitting on top of the rupture rather than beside it. A magnitude 7.7 on this kind of structure will do damage that a much larger megathrust event 150 miles out to sea might not. Same planet, same tectonic engine, completely different arithmetic for the people living above it. It is also why every one of the deadly aftershocks in this sequence has been in the 5 and 6 range rather than the 7s. At 10 kilometers depth and directly underfoot, a magnitude 5.6 is more than enough. Now, the honest part, because there is a version of this circulating online that is wrong in 3 specific ways, and if I let you leave without correcting them, I would be doing the same thing as the accounts that farm engagement off other people's disasters. First, yesterday's Banda Sea earthquake. On the 24th of August, at 10 minutes past 2 in the afternoon in Universal Time, a strong, shallow earthquake struck the Banda Sea at 10 kilometers depth. The German center reported it at magnitude 6.4. Other catalogs came in nearer 6.0. That spread is normal for a first-pass automatic solution, and it will tighten up. It is not a Flores aftershock. It is not the sequence spreading. The epicenter sits at roughly 6.8 degrees south and 127.5 degrees east, which places it something like 670 kilometers east of the Flores rupture. More than 400 miles. That is about the distance from New York City to Cleveland. It is a different tectonic neighborhood entirely, a region with its own long and violent history of large earthquakes that has nothing to do with the Back-Arc Thrust north of Flores. The Banda Sea produces events of this size regularly. It did so this year and last year and the year before. Second, the aftershock count. 6,400 is a very large number and it looks alarming written down, but for a magnitude 7.7 rupture on a shallow fault, thousands of aftershocks is what the physics predicts. The strongest aftershock in the whole sequence was magnitude 6.2. The main shock released close to 180 times more energy than that. 33 of the 6,409 events have exceeded magnitude 5. 139 of them were felt by residents. The rest are small. The count is high because the monitoring network is good, not because the Earth has gone into a new mode. Third, and this is the one I want to be most careful with, a jump on day 6 is not a prediction. It does not mean a larger earthquake is loading. Aftershock sequences frequently show bursts, especially when the stress migrates into a fresh patch of crust and sets off a subsequence of its own, which is what those western clusters look like. Indonesia's agency has been explicit that the overall trend is declining and has asked residents to disregard unverified rumors. Their working projection is that the sequence continues for another 3 to 4 weeks from the point at which they issued it, with decreasing frequency. What is worth watching is not the total. It is where the events are happening, and whether the western clusters keep expanding toward populated highland districts, which brings me back to that tsunami number, and to 1992. On the 12th of December that year, a magnitude 7.8 earthquake struck this same fault system north of Flores. It killed something on the order of 2,500 people. The waves that came ashore were not chest high. In places on the northern coast, and especially around the small island of Babi, the water reached heights measured in tens of meters, and entire coastal communities were erased. 2 earthquakes, same fault system, nearly the same magnitude, 34 years apart. One produced a tsunami that killed thousands. The other produced a wave that peaked at about 1.6 meters. Why the difference? The best available explanation for 1992 is that the earthquake shaking triggered an underwater landslide. Submarine slope failures displace enormous volumes of water very abruptly and very locally, and they can generate waves far larger than the earthquake alone would produce, concentrated on nearby coastlines. The fault motion starts it, but the collapsing seafloor is what does the killing. This month, the fault ruptured all the way to the seafloor, lifted a large area of it, and generated a tsunami exactly as you would expect. What it does not appear to have done is knock loose a major submarine landslide. That is the difference between 1.6 meters and a coastline being wiped away. And it came down to the geometry and stability of underwater slopes that nobody could have surveyed in advance. I find that genuinely unsettling, and I say that as someone who reads these bulletins every day. 2,500 lives, or 83, decided in part by whether a slope of wet sediment held together. This is why researchers keep pushing for better mapping of the seafloor around these back-arc systems. The eastern half of Indonesia has been struck by more tsunamis than the more heavily studied western half, and at least 6 tsunami-generating earthquakes of magnitude 6.5 or greater have hit this region since the year 1800. The hazard is well established, the seafloor is not well mapped. So where does Flores stand tonight, on day 10? More than 110,000 people are displaced. That figure is not a typo, 110,785, as of the most recent count. Enough people to fill a large stadium and leave tens of thousands standing outside. In East Manggarai alone, over 15,000 were displaced, and only around 960 of them were in official shelters. The rest went to whatever felt safer than a house with cracks in it. Family land, a schoolyard, a tarp on a hillside. Nearly 12,000 homes are damaged. The regional hospital in Maumere has been running patient care out of emergency tents because parts of the main building are unsafe and because staff cannot risk having patients inside masonry when the next aftershock arrives. Shelters in Manggarai have reported shortages of food, clean water, and medicine. The national agency has set compensation levels for damaged housing, with lightly damaged homes eligible for around 15 million rupiah and moderately damaged homes for about 30 million, pending verification. Some of the tourism picture has recovered. Labuan Bajo and Komodo National Park have largely reopened. Other sites have not. Kelimutu, the volcano with the 3-colored crater lakes that is the most photographed place on the island, has landslides on 2 of its crater walls and remains under park authority restriction, and people are still counting. The felt earthquake feed for western Flores logged 9 felt aftershocks in a 24-hour window this week. The most recent one at the time of writing was a magnitude 3.4, 16 kilometers deep, on land, 32 kilometers northeast of Ruteng, at 17 minutes past 6 in the morning. Small, barely worth a headline anywhere else on Earth. But if you are in a tent outside Ruteng, having not slept properly in 10 days, having watched a neighbor die of shock after a morning tremor, a magnitude 3.4 at dawn is not a data point. It is the moment you sit up in the dark and wait to find out whether it is building. The projection from Indonesia's agency puts the tail of this sequence running into the middle of September. That gives us a specific thing to watch. If the daily counts resume their decline from that day 6 peak, and the western clusters stop expanding, this becomes a slow recovery story about roofs and roads, and 100,000 people going home. If the migration continues westward under the Manggarai highlands, the districts that have already buried people who died of fear rather than falling masonry are the ones that will feel it first. Nobody can tell you which of those it will be. The honest answer is that the sequence has not yet settled into a shape simple enough to extrapolate, and the agency monitoring it has said so out loud. So we watch the map, not the headline. Subscribe and turn on the bell, because I will be tracking the daily counts and the cluster positions out of Kupang for as long as this runs, and the next real update on Flores is due within days, not weeks. The world stopped talking about this island on day 3. The island is on day 10, and the counter is still moving.